Hi, welcome back to my shop. This is the second part of bracketology where I'm constructing the bracket feet for my chest of drawers. In the second part, I'm going to show you how I cut the front profile for the bracket feet using my bandsaw, as well as this basic dovetailed box. Alright, so now that I have my bracket feet all glued up, I'm going to start with the back here. The back feet only need to get one more cut, and I've already scribed my new profile. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but I have a nice curved profile that I need to scribe there, and it's basically just going to carve this out, create the coves where I need them to be. Now, it doesn't really matter how good the back looks when I'm done, but it's pretty important that that curve looks nice and clean when I'm finished. So the way I'm going to do this is on the bandsaw. And so all I have to do is use a square reference surface like this box. And I'm just going to place the bracket foot right on the corner of that box, and then I'll be able to run it through the bandsaw like this. And the only important thing there is that this box is in fact square, both on the bottom and on the top, which it is. And that will ensure that I get a nice straight cut when I make that cut on the bandsaw. Now for this procedure, because that curve that I need to cut is a fairly tight radius, I really couldn't pull that off using that 1/2" bandsaw blade that I've been using before. This is a concave curve, and so that wider blade would get in the way trying to get around that curve. So I did go out and I got a 1/4" 10 tooth per inch blade, and that should really work well for this. Having 10 teeth per inch will also give me a nicer kind of clean cut, so I'll have less cleanup work to do with sandpaper when I'm done. Alright, so here I am making the first cut, and this is such a tight radius, I'm even going to make some relief cuts to start out, and that's going to make it easier for me to waste out that material. So now I'll be able to do the final wasting out of that curve. Alright, I just finished cleaning up that top curve, and you can see that I have a pretty nice profile, and it's actually fairly clean just right off the bandsaw because I used those 10 teeth per inch. So then I'll just need to sort of fair these curves a little bit more using some sandpaper, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that in the next step. But what's really kind of cool about this is you end up with curved dovetails. When this is nice and cleaned up, it's going to look pretty cool. I'm starting the front legs now, and the only real difference here between the front legs and the back legs is that I have to cut that profile on both sides. So I've redrawn my slightly shallower curve on one side after erasing the old one, and I have to double check to make sure that that's not going to be so deep as it's going to cut into my splines. I just want to make one last check before I actually make this cut. So I've just got my combo square out, and I'm just checking one more time. I have it set to the depth of where that spline will be, and then I'm coming around to my curve, and I'm just double checking, and I can see that my curve does fall about a 1/16 of an inch inside that line. So I do just need to be really careful that I don't cross that pencil line at all. Otherwise, I would start to expose the edge of that spline right there, which would be bad news. Now, what makes rescribing pretty easy, you know, you'd think it'd be challenging putting a flat template on a curved piece, but I just double checked, and basically you can see where the end grain is exposed from the piece that I already cut off. Follows that line perfectly. So I double checked it and darkened the line so I'll be able to see it. And that will give me my reference point for cutting the second curve on the other side. All right, so basically we get the first sort of look at what that profile is going to look like. Obviously it still needs to get cleaned up with some sandpaper, but it gives you an idea what that profile will look like all the way around. It's a nice gentle curve that sort of mates with the curve on the other side and leaves me with a nice kind of block foot on the bottom, which will sort of look nice with the stepped front of the chest of drawers. Cleaning up the bandsaw marks is actually fairly easy, and it's actually made even easier by the fact that I'm using butternut, which is nice, soft, easily workable wood with hand tools. So all I'm going to do is clamp the foot into my vise, and I'm just going to use a rasp, and I'm going to use the curved edge of it, which happens to be slightly more concave than the profile of my foot. If it were more convex, it would be challenging, or if it weren't as tight a radius, I wouldn't be able to get into the bottom there. So this actually works out pretty well. And all I have to do is sort of work it along the bottom there, and the key is just keeping it straight so I can clean out all the way into the bottom of that curve. Then when I need to do the convex surface here, I just flip it around and I use the flat surface. And that's actually fairly straightforward as well. I just want to kind of keep the rasp moving so that I'm not really flattening out anyone's spot. And really my only concern here is making sure that the contour gives me a nice fair curve. It doesn't have to be an exact fit, because this isn't a joint. It just needs to look sort of appealing to the eye. And then what I'll do occasionally is pop it out of my vise and check it with my original template and see how I'm doing. I can sight down that edge and see where I need to remove a little more material or a little less material. And I can see here that I'm actually pretty darn close. So I really am just smoothing this out at this point. I don't need to remove any additional material. Once I've gotten this profile to the point where I like it using the rasp, then I'll just switch over to varying grits of sandpaper to clean up any of the marks left by the rasp. And then once I've gotten it to a nice point where I really like the curve, all I have to do is flip it around and then repeat the process for the other side. As a last step, I just kind of smooth this out using sandpaper, continually sighting down that line. And I know that I've nailed this curve when I can't see any end grain. My miter meets up perfectly all along the way. And you can see I pretty much have it at that point. You don't see any end grain on either side, so I'm getting a perfect, nice miter. So I've pretty much got this thing to the point where I want it. And that's pretty much the process for doing the bracket feet. So I'm just ready to mount them now. Now that I have my bracket feet completed, I just need to figure out the best method for actually attaching them to the bottom of the case. One common method that you'll often see is that there'll be a rabbet cut into the top of the bracket foot, and then you can just take a triangular piece of material, sit it in that rabbet, and then that gives you a great method of just securing it through the bottom of that. The problem I have is that these bracket feet are sort of delicate, and they're smaller than a typical bracket foot, so I don't have a lot of material to wrap it out there, and it might make this very fragile. So I'm going to take two different approaches for both the back and the front bracket feet. For the backs, I have this nice wide back piece that I can actually use, and what I'm going to do is just take a piece of scrap and glue it to that back piece, and that'll give me a nice surface for basically just countersinking a few holes, and then I can screw up into the back of the case that way. For the front feet, however, I don't really have that option because there's so little material here, but I can use that to my advantage. What I can do is just countersink a hole right at this sort of thin point of the bracket feet, enough to hide the head of a screw, and then I can just screw that up into the bottom of the case. And as long as I pre-drill all my holes, I won't run any risk of actually splitting the material. And because these are thin enough, I can actually get a screw up through there. So unless you were looking at this directly from the bottom, you would never see those screws at all. So that's the method I'm going to take, and it should be kind of simple and straightforward. I'm over at the drill press now, and I basically went and found the type of screw that I'm going to use to attach the bracket feet, and I'm setting my depth stop so that I have about half of those threads in that screw will extend through the bottom of that hole when I'm done. So that's about where I want to have it. So then all I do is I'm basically just lining up the bit to the center of the bracket, and I'm setting the quill as close as I can to where this OG juts out, so that I'm still hitting, you know, sort of the thickest part of the material here, but I'm still far enough toward the end of this bracket that it's going to keep the foot from rotating back and forth if it gets jarred once it's attached. And that gives me a nice screw hole to register against. Now I just finished drilling the pilot hole with a smaller bit. It's going to run all the way through the stock. So I just make sure that that brad point lines up where the brad point from the first bit did. And there I've got my piloted screw hole, and that's ready to go into the bottom of the case. Now all I have to do is attach the bracket feet. And the important piece here is that when I'm aligning this, I want to make sure that that bevel starts at the same place all the way around and that I'm nice and square. So I just align it to where it's going to go and then continue my pilot hole into the case, being sure not to go all the way through. And then I can drive it home. And I don't want to tighten that all the way until I drill my second pilot hole. Perfect. And that's all there is to it. Well, here's a look at the final case with the bracket feet completely finished and installed. As you can see, it kind of gives a nice width to the bottom of the case, and it also adds a little curvature to what otherwise is a fairly linear case. So I'm pretty happy with the design, and I really like how they came out. I kind of like how they sort of offset the base a little bit more and sort of give the thing a little bit more height. So I'm pretty happy with how this came out. After this, I really just have a little more work to do on the guts of the case to hold the drawers, and then I just need to fine tune and fit the drawers in place, and then I'm ready for finish.